All right, welcome to the Kris-T-Nick podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about streaming services. Nick here has researched a lot recently about streaming services. Nick, tell me what some streaming services are.
So, streaming services are a way that people can watch, listen, or view, which is the same thing as watch, any kind of media online. Now, this goes for movies, TV shows, and even music or podcasts, as we are doing one right now.
So, are there any negatives to doing any of this at all?
Absolutely, Chris. All I talked about were the negatives here. First thing we got, streaming services are bad for those consumers that use them. You know, people don't think that, but, you know, they're actually pretty bad for you. Streaming services also don't give artists a fair deal when it comes to making content on said platforms. Also, physical media becomes obsolete because of streaming services.
So I don't want to cut you off here, but we're going to go back to the first point here. So you're saying streaming services are bad for the consumers that use them. How are they bad for them?
Well, I'll tell you, Chris. I looked at some articles that talked about this, and basically it's the health. It's the health, Chris. Viewers are getting addicted to these streaming services. You know, they're spending hours of their time, of their day, just sitting in front of a screen, sometimes a tiny screen, which is bad for their eyes, but they're sitting in front of these screens that just convey bad things, I'll tell you what.
So are you telling me that there's only bad things with sitting and watching streams?
I mean, if I took a day to watch 5 movies nonstop and not get up to use the bathroom, then yeah, I would definitely tell you there's some bad things going on.
You know, I do agree with what you have to say there. It does seem like a very bad thing to do that. We're going to move on to the second point here that you talked about. You said streaming services don't give these artists a fair deal.
I did say that. Artists make this content and they post it. Well, they don't post it. They get it posted on the streaming services, and they're not getting enough money. Now, an example of this is Dave Chappelle. Are you familiar with Dave Chappelle, stand-up comedian Dave Chappelle?
I am decently.
Dave Chappelle had a comedy show called The Chappelle Show. It was put on Netflix, and he was not given a single cent for it being on Netflix. It was done without his consent, and he didn't get any money from it. Now, that's not the only example I have, Chris Wolf. I'll tell you what. Scarlett Johansson, you familiar with Scarlett Johansson?
I believe so, yes. Yeah.
Disney Plus put out her movie Black Widow on streaming services, and she sued Disney because putting it on the streaming service would lose her a lot more money than if it was exclusively in theaters.
Interesting. Very interesting point that you make there. It's ridiculous that they don't get a fair deal on that. We're going to move on to the third one that we talked about here. Making physical media obsolete. Can you explain to me what you mean by making physical media obsolete?
CDs, Chris. DVDs, Blu-rays, tapes, vinyls. I'll tell you, all these things going out of business. They are not being sold as much as they used to be. I'll tell you what, these streaming services kind of make physical media a thing of the past. CD sales were a big thing for artists, especially those indie artists. And now they're not making that money. You know, these streaming services like Spotify, if we're taking music as an example, they take a portion of the profits that they get from these listens, and they're not making as much money as they definitely could be. And especially indie artists, we're going to go back to the indie artists real quick, they are trying to make traction, but they cannot with these physical media sales. And streaming services are not pushing these indie artists because they're just not popular, you know? Why would they push the indie stuff when they can push, like, Doja Cat or something?
You know, man, I do understand what you mean by pushing Doja Cat.
But that's not all. Let me go back to the first point. I feel like I could talk about that a little bit more.
Okay.
Now, not only are people physically being harmed by the streaming services, the streaming services aren't attacking the people, but health-wise is what I was discussing earlier. Mental health is a big issue with streaming services.
I agree.
Netflix, you know Netflix.
Oof.
Platforms like Netflix and Disney Plus encourage the act of binge watching. Now, do you know what binge watching is?
Binge watching is bad. You watch a whole bunch of things all at once.
I'll tell you what, I've binge watched a lot of things, and I do not ever feel good about myself afterwards. Depression is a very common factor in watching these streaming services for hours on end. Now, these streaming platforms are encouraging binge watching, which just induces things like depression, other mental health issues, maybe anxiety, maybe lack of sleep if you were staying up late.
It's crazy. That's crazy.
It's insane. You know, Disney Plus, they'll put out a show once a week to try to combat the binge watching craze, but in the end, they'll end up putting out a trailer, a commercial even, for the entire show to be streamed on Disney Plus. They're encouraging binge watching, even though they're doing little pausing techniques to try and discourage it. It's crazy.
That's crazy. It really is crazy.
I like streaming services. I use them quite a bit, but I've always been a stickler for physical media. I feel like we need to keep physical media as much as we possibly can, as it'll help us, you know, keep these movies and shows that perhaps aren't even on streaming services that we see nowadays. But
yeah,
it's complicated.
Yeah,
I mean,
I do agree. Yeah,
it's horrible. These streaming services, they're cruel to the artists. They're cruel to the viewers that watch them and spend countless millions of dollars on them. And I'll tell you what, Chris, that's about it that we have for today.
You know, I do really appreciate you sharing all this insight. And, you know, it's really brought a thing to my eye here saying to how bad streaming services are for most people that use them throughout the world here.
Is that right?
It is, and right. Thank you so much today. Thank you, everybody. You can buy it on Patreon, $5. Goodbye now.
The podcast you can buy on Patreon. Thank you.